Namaste, hello, and to India Global Week 2020, Be the Revival, India and a Better New World. I'm your host, Priyanka Deo, reporting from New Delhi. And as Manoj said, India Inc. is truly providing us with a fantastic platform to exchange ideas and explore opportunities in a way that we've not done before. The numbers are very, very impressive. I'm humbled to host this conference. This just in, as of day 2, we have over 10,000 registered attendees across 69 countries, along with global leaders and influencers from all over the world. So really happy to be here, really happy that you're out here. Follow us on India Inc. Corp, that's at India INCORP on Twitter, and leave your questions, your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #BeThe. With that being said, we have a very exciting panel discussion coming up. India currently faces 21st century challenges. As PM Narendra Modi says, one of the greatest challenges that the Indian economy specifically confronts is the ability of the Indian state to be responsive and to be capable of a 21st century economy. That's what this panel discussion is going to explore and answer. I can't wait for it, and let's find out more. Now, this session is presented by the LSE South Asia Center, and I now hand it over to our moderator, Ms. Mukulika Banerjee, Director of the South Asia Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, that's my graduate school as well, to moderate the session. Ms. Banerjee, namaste from New Delhi, and the floor is all yours.
Namaste. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to what is going to be a very, I think, lively discussion. There are a number of issues around the issue of state capacity and the economy, thinking about the way forward that we want to raise in this panel. You've already heard that quote by the Prime Minister. India is a 19th century administration negotiating 21st century challenges. But fortunately, India is a country that is up to these challenges, certainly with its administrative power, its brain power, its policy power. And we've represented members of these sectors at this panel discussions. We have 4 excellent panelists who bring with them their fairly unique expertise and perspective. Each of them will speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, and they are, in the order in which they will speak, Ms. Vini Mahajan, who is a senior IAS officer, the Chief Secretary of the Government of Punjab. Then there's Sajid Chenoy, who is Chief India Economist at JP Morgan and member of the PM's Economic Advisory Council. Following him will be Dr. Meghla Krishnamurthy, who is Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research and Associate Professor at Ashoka University, and who is leading the newly launched State Capacity Initiative that is thinking about a number of the issues that we are discussing today. And to wrap it all up and bring a number of these discussions, issues together, is Yamini Aiyar, who is the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research based in Delhi. And of course, this is an LSE South Asia Center event, so I should also say that Yamini is an LSE alumnus, which we are extremely proud about. The discussions between LSE and CPR in particular have been ongoing for the last year or so. So it gives me really great pleasure to invite each of our panelists and the experts to this discussion. So Vini, if I may start with you. Yesterday in his inaugural address for India Inc.'s incredible event, he said, quote, "We are laying the red carpet for all global companies to come and invest in India." Now, you as a key architect of Invest Punjab, restructuring regulatory environment in Punjab and of governance reforms, what would you say have been the key challenges to make a state like Punjab investor friendly from the perspective of state administration and investment?
Thank you, Mukulika, for that question. So, I think it's a no-brainer that every state in India is acutely conscious of the need to promote investments in the manufacturing and services sectors, We recognize that the primarily agricultural nature of the economy is not helping the growth rate, is not helping provide employment opportunities. And in Punjab, we are more acutely conscious of the fact than perhaps others might be. We have, in some ways, benefited from, but we have also sacrificed in some sense for the food security of the country. And agriculture was the mainstay, was something that we were very proud of. We grew paddy when Punjab had no idea what paddy was all about. We were not a rice-eating people. But now we recognize that we are plateauing because agriculture all over the world does not grow in other sectors. And so increasingly, there have been in the past several years efforts at attracting an industry. And I think the starting point is to somehow make it known to potential investors that if they choose to come here, they would be in a system that is welcoming. And so that brings in all the aspects of state capacity. So there are obviously regulatory requirements. There are issues around how land should be used, the various norms of urbanization and town planning. There are issues around water usage. There are all kinds of approvals, clearances that are needed. And there is a recognition that while these are essential for not just the environment, but the physical development of the state and the eventual prosperity of its people, there is also recognition that sometimes the processes are onerous, and we need, therefore, to look at ease of doing business. So that much used phrase actually is something that we have been living with. I joined as the industry secretary of the state about 2 years ago, and trust me, we were constantly looking at what are the various aspects that create pinpoints for potential investors, and how do we work with the various departments of the state to ease those up, automatic renewals, all of that stuff. So, but I think it's a little more than that. The entire environment must be conducive. You cannot work on individual bits and pieces, which is sometimes what the World Bank Ease of Doing Business as adopted in the Indian context tends to do. So we have actually been looking at it as a more holistic kind of improvement in the services delivery, in having much more of IT intervention so that services are delivered more smoothly, so that there is much more process re-engineering that is done even as we introduce IT. And that was one of the main functions of the governance reform department. For example, people have complaints all the time of the government. My child's birth certificate needs a correction, and I'm running around trying to get that correction done. Just one of many. And people are now so aware. So when I pick up my phone in the morning, I have this string of messages from unknown numbers, many of them actually pointing out issues. I have this, what would actually amount to a full A4 size sheet from a young girl in Kolkata complaining about how her grandmother's property had been usurped by some private citizen, and she should be supported by the state and its machinery in settling that matter. So people are aware, they expect outcomes. They can find your email address and your mobile numbers, and they know WhatsApp, and they have expectations of the government, which sometimes we are not. I'm not able to commit that I would be able to respond to even a fraction of the 30 million people of the state, not to include those in Kolkata who also have some issues. But we can put in place systems. So what we've done is we've put in place a policy that this shall be the state's grievance redressal policy. There will be a portal. There will also be eventually a call center so that people who are not IT savvy can just call in and make their complaints. This is how the complaints will flow from one level to the other. This is how the response will go to the citizen. If the citizen is not satisfied, this is the automatic escalation. And this is the next escalation and the next, but this is where it will end. And after that, then we will not repeatedly go into that grievance, and we will apply AI and machine learning tools to see that the same complaint is not repeatedly sent from various channels and so on. So these are some of the challenges of how do we get IT, for instance, into state functioning, how do we embed it, and how do we ensure process reform in a very fundamental manner? How do we get in the expertise that is increasingly needed? People are not just looking for satisfaction of their issues, they're also litigating. There are all kinds of legal processes, and we do not have the battery of lawyers that perhaps government needs to be able to clean out. And government has become one of the largest litigants, therefore, and is clogging the courts. So how do we make sure we embed legal skills into governance at all levels so that issues are properly examined and not allowed to escalate? I think this is just a bunch of issues because, again, if we started, Mukulika, talking about the investor coming in. Now, investors need contract enforcement. And for that, they need to be confident that your judicial system will give speedy resolution of any contractual dispute. So do we have a contract? Do we make a commercial court which will look at these issues and fast track them? Something like the SECs we learned from China. So we have small geographical kind of silos which are global of global standard, both in their infrastructure and in their governance. Is that a better way to go, or do we try to take the entire region kicking and screaming and slowly, but make everybody go? We did go the SEC route. The special economic zones were very much a flavor of the system. But on the whole, I believe the consensus is that it doesn't really help to have on clouds. We should be looking whatever improvement we can effect, and the bureaucracy is a large animal. It is naturally constrained by the rules required of large systems, and not to mention public oversight, judicial oversight, media, and all of those. But whatever improvements we do should be wide-ranging, because it's not just the foreign investor; it's also the disempowered citizen who needs the same level of efficiency and the same level of justice from the government.
Great. Thank you very much. You've introduced an idea of what was called in the 19th century the social state. And I think there is a huge expectation of the idea of the Indian state from its citizens. And of course, for our audience, it will be astonishing to know that a senior civil servant like yours, mobile number is freely available for young people to WhatsApp directly. I mean, it's astonishing the kind of access that one has to functionaries of the state. And a million miles away, I'm assuming, from this kind of state bureaucracy machinery is the world you inhabit, Sajid, at JP Morgan as the chief India economist. But you also serve on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So can you tell us a little bit about how the state and the private work together? How does the state draw on the expertise from people like yourself from beyond the state?
Hi, Mukulika, thank you very much. With the caveat that these are my own personal views and don't represent that of the PMEAC, let me just say, when we talk about state capacity, the thinking very much is about, micro-level schemes and the execution of those schemes, or using technology to improve the interface between the citizen and the state. But I think at a time like this, when the world is facing almost an existential crisis from COVID and the economic impact, we shouldn't forget the importance of state capacity in the macro front. And what do I mean by that? We typically think of this more in a chronic sense. When we think of macro state capacity, we think about how do we build tax capacity, tax to GDP ratios, how do we ensure we have a structure to keep inflation under control. But I think the last 6 months has really upended macroeconomic policy making. And I think it has laid bare both the importance of macro policy, but the importance of building state capacity on these dimensions in emerging markets. Let me specify what I mean. We're facing the biggest growth crisis in almost 100 years. The IMF projects that global growth is going to be -5% or thereabouts this year. The last time this happened was in the 1940s. 95% of developed economies in this year will contract. That's quite astounding. The quarter that just passed by, from April to June, was the biggest global contraction ever recorded in history. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that policymakers, both in developed markets and emerging markets, have had to throw out the old rule book. And we've had to have had to intervene like never before. We've seen massive fiscal deficits across the world. 10% of GDP is almost the norm in developed economies. 30% of GDP, if you add up the contingent liabilities. Emerging markets are increasing their deficits like no other. Central banks, who used to be the lender of last resort to the banking system, have become the buyer of first resort in the broader economy. They're forced to behave like commercial banks. So this is the whole new paradigm of macroeconomic policy making. The reason this links to state capacity is developed economies have the natural advantage, given their long institutional history, that you can throw out the rule book 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, and nobody's going to doubt that you will return to orthodoxy at some point. So the Fed can do things that other central banks can't because the US benefits from what we call exorbitant privilege. But emerging markets don't have that luxury. Equally aggressive, equally creative, equally manic, so to speak, in these times, provide a lot of fiscal support, provide a lot of unconventional monetary support to save these economies. But at the same time, we'll have to create institutional capacity to recommit to orthodoxy when crisis is done. Otherwise, you face the wrath of markets, you face the wrath of investors, you face the wrath of rating agencies. So if you ask me what is the urgent ask of the day today, it is to create the macroeconomic capacities, whether it's fiscal, whether it's monetary, whether it's regulatory, to be nimble, to act fast, to act unconventionally, to do what it takes, but simultaneously create the institutional structures that will signal to the world that when this storm is past, we will go back to orthodoxy. We have a mechanism by which these deficits will come down and debt will become sustainable, and we will target inflation. And I'm saying this because if we don't create those capacities, then you will be hindered in the amount of support you can provide to start with. And what is a 3-quarter crisis of some emerging markets could become a 3-year crisis. So I think we've got to now change what we expect of macroeconomic state capacity, for India, for other emerging markets after COVID. There are excellent examples of India having done that. I'll give one example that I think most will identify. India had almost 10% inflation between 2006 and 2016. Then we had an institutional response to that. The monetary policy moved to an inflation targeting regime. We changed the RBI Act. We set up a monetary policy committee that decides on interest rates. And guess what? Over the last 3 years, inflation is half of that, 4%. Right? So my point is, when you do have well thought out institutional responses on the macro front, we've already seen the benefits of that. We're very good at episodic responses, right? Whether it's running elections, rolling out Aadhaar, creating bank accounts, other social schemes, toilets. I think what we need is preemptively creating these institutions. So I'll end by saying that I think we need to create what I call institutional capacities that will pre-commit to returning to orthodoxy when the crisis is over. If you create those capacities now, you have much more latitude to respond and firefight during the crisis, number one. And number two, in this world of modern finance, when financial sector is developing so quickly, we have to create those regulatory architectures as well. I think the other upshot of this COVID crisis is going to be a financial system that is badly damaged, and therefore having the capacities to recognize these bad loans, to restructure enterprises, to recapitalize institutions so that the financial sector is healthy and lending again becomes critical. So I know I bypassed your question a little bit. I think India has demonstrated where you can use public and private together to create these capacities, but more than ever before that's needed now. The very last thing I'd say is if you look beyond COVID, where is the next set of reforms? It's really factor market reforms. It's land, it's labor, it's power. These are all at the subnational level. So I think the next set of capacities really have to be not so much at the central level, but at the subnational level, so that you can create this competitive federalism on all these critical issues, but states have the capacity to learn from each other and to execute best practices. But let me stop there.
Brilliant, Sajid. That sets us up so well for the next two speakers, because in a sense, I know Mekhla and Yamini have both been working, having just launched the State Capacity Initiative. So Mekhla, there are really two sets of questions I want you to address if you can. One is, I think, following so nicely on from Sajid's really clear statement about the need of the hour, which the crisis of the pandemic has made very evident, that you really can't move. It's the governments that have had institutional state capacity that have responded best to the virus. And therefore, if there was any doubt about this issue, this is what we need in India. And so I'd like you to speak a little bit about that initiative of yours that you've launched at CPR. But also specifically on drawing on your expertise on work in the informal economy and agricultural market reforms. If you could just respond again, the Prime Minister yesterday said that reforms in the SME sectors are booming, that investors to come and invest in hard farmers. So if you could talk about that as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mukulika, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a particular pleasure actually to follow in this conversation to two very important interventions. I think when you listen to the perspective of a Chief Secretary of a state who has and has been Secretary of a ministry, thinking particularly about industrial investment and the routine administrative challenges, and then Sajid's very powerful intervention about macroeconomic management and that we need a new paradigm for thinking about macroeconomic capacity in India. It's exciting because these are conversations that don't often happen together. So one of the problems has been that the conversations around macroeconomy and macroeconomic policy have happened with one group of people. The challenges of what we think of as, the real agrarian economy or the informal economy is dominated by another group of people. There is the challenge of economic policy making at the state level and then at the center. And Sajid very rightly said that many of these capacities have to be built at the state level. So in some ways, what the State Capacity Initiative is hoping to do is to shed some deep light on these questions, to change the public narrative. Issues on state capacity tend to be marginalized issues. We have a very common discourse in India where we say India has good policy and not enough good implementation, right? And effectively, we've seen in the case of the economy, we need better policy. Part of what Sajid saying, we need to actually be more effective. But also, policies which need to be implemented are not good policies. And part of what we hope to do in this initiative is to break these binaries that we've created in how we think about India's public sector and the roles of the Indian state and its institutional capacities. So, our hope is that over the next few years, we have many more such conversations, but really go very deeply into these questions and dynamics, and which remain remarkably understudied, under-engaged with, and there's a lot of polarization. I think that was very vivid in this particular moment, post-COVID or in the middle of COVID or wherever we are with it, that, we have really seen the vulnerabilities of our economy and the vulnerabilities of an imagination of what the Indian economy is, right? And our ability to engage with it at all levels. And I think here I just sort of mentioned three kinds of capacities and then move quickly. And, the question of agriculture is one that takes on from it. The first is the capacity of the economic. And I would argue along with Sajid that in addition to having much greater imagination about how we deal with the Indian macroeconomy, we need a new imagination for the Indian economy altogether. And this is something Yamini and I also have recently written about, but this is because we have continuously had these binaries between the rural and the urban, between the agrarian and the non-agrarian sectors, which have, and between the formal and informal, which have actually exacerbated very deep fissures and structural fault lines in our thinking on the economy and our planning for it. And I think this is an extremely important moment for us to correct some of that and to see it as a moment to reimagine, what the Indian economy can be. So that's one set of capacities. And when you do that kind of reimagination, you need very deep capacities, right? You need a lot of dialogue, you need a lot of deliberation, you need a lot of different kinds of expertise, and you need institutions that can think about policy making and planning at all levels. We also need, what Sajid was talking about, to go back, right? At some point, there's crisis and then you return. And these are routine capacities. We often think about state capacity as a very banal or everyday element. But, the routine management of a complex economy is in no way a banal task. Factor markets, land, labor, capital, these are markets that are incredibly complex, incredibly diverse, incredibly structurally unequal in India. They are incredibly dynamic as well. And they are political. They are politicized across the board as well. So when you're dealing with markets of that kind, your regulatory capacity, your routine regulatory institutions need to be nimble, dexterous. They may return to a sense of stability and routine and reliability. That's something that the Chief Secretary also mentioned, that you need people to feel that this is something reliable, that it's competitive. But at the same time, it needs to be dynamic. And those are the capacities we haven't built very much across our sectors. And with land, labor, and capital reforms, we are going to need both reforms and then building up this kind of systemic regulatory capacity at all levels. She mentioned dispute resolutions, and that's just one example of a critical area in which you need regulatory capacity. But I would like to say that regulatory reform, which has actually captured our imagination in terms of thinking about what economic reform is limited. And this is precisely where I think the role of the state and of public institutions is to go beyond just thinking about frameworks for regulation, but thinking about frameworks for investment. The government's role is also in these cases to make markets, to strengthen the hand of weaker participants, to think about the terms of engagement in unequal markets. In the farm sector, this is critical because many of the reforms that we've just announced at the state level have been tried out at various points. States like Bihar have repealed their entire APMC Act. A number of other states have initiated regulatory reform. But we haven't seen the kind of buoyancy, investment in these markets that you would expect. And there's a critical role for the government to play in actually investing in these markets, right? Investing in the supply chain and thinking about new models of credit, new institutions for aggregation. In India, we love to talk about the success of Amul. We talk about this is a great success story. But behind this is a great deal of public investment that was spent over years on public science, on the kinds of institutions that would be required, on the kind of investment that would be required, and on core infrastructure in the Indian economy. And we have seen time and time again, whether it's across these markets, that the private sector goes, the organized, responsive private sector goes where there's a strong public sector, right? There's a strong presence where it has gone and invested, and then you see multiplier effects. So without over-determining the role of the state, without suggesting that we need to return to a period where there's a license raj and there's extreme bureaucratization, I think we need to have a reimagination where reform and regulatory reform is not the retreat of the state, but actually building the kinds of institutions that we really require. I'll stop there.
Nicola, thank you very much. So Yamini, I know we are running out of time. So I think I know you can speak to this topic in a number of different ways, but with your president of CPR hat on, can you talk a little bit? I mean, we are a university at LSE. You're doing research at CPR. What exactly is the role of research, of the kind of work that you produce at CPR, into these conversations with macroeconomists, with the state functionaries, with policymakers?
Thank you, Mukulika, for that opportunity to also bring what institutions like ours do into this conversation. I think all the speakers before me have laid out the complexity of the challenge ahead of us. There is the routine administrative regulatory challenge that is being innovated on in different ways across the country, and the experiences that Vini spoke about the steps that Invest Punjab is taking are an important example of that. There is the need for new thinking and new imaginations at the macroeconomy level. Mekla spoke about the need for bringing in new economic imagination into planning of the economy as a whole, which essentially means you're looking at it from, what Government of India is doing all the way down to what the local municipality is doing. All of this essentially pushes you to ask one very critical question, which is, is the architecture designed to be able to be responsive to the challenge that it confronts? And I think that in many ways, our expectations, and I think Vini mentioned this as well, citizen expectations on the government are manifold, and we're doing all of this in a democratic context. So factor market reforms seem very straightforward when you think of it from the perspective that Sajid has, but will be near impossible when you think about it from the perspective of a member of parliament that has to go back to face an election. Which means that a state that was designed primarily to function providing for law and order and revenue extraction also now needs to be deliberative, needs to be engaged, needs to be able to negotiate these transitions. And in the process of negotiating transitions, it needs all the help it can get. It needs the help in terms of being able to frame the research agenda, build the public discourse around these issues, bring different stakeholders into a collective conversation. Mekla talked about the macroeconomists, the administrative reform conversation, the informal economy conversation, all happening in different places. These need to come together because collectively we are all focusing with the same goal of making India, firmly placing India on the path to prosperity and growth. And that sort of intellectual brokering role, framing the research, bringing together people, engaging in a dialogue is what an institution like ours does. And in being able to place some of these difficult questions on the table, when we talk about ease of doing business, it's very easy to say, here's a shopping list of what India needs to do and I'll come in and invest. It's equally important to understand the context in which you are going to expect this shopping list to be architected, and also to understand the complexities of these things. Regulation in A, reform in A may not necessarily, as Mekla pointed out, opening up or privatizing markets may not necessarily lead to the kind of competition that you expect it to do, because the state actually has to now invest in building those markets. So bringing in these conversations into a framework is an important role that we it's fundamentally the challenge of state capacity. But one last point I want to make, and I hope that we can request Vini to come back in here. I think what Sajid said is so important, that there is a very central role of the state to play in the future of the reform story of India. And the question of how the state governments engage with each other and with the federal system is going to be crucial. So I did want to give over 2 or 3 minutes to Vini, if she's still there, to just talk to us a little bit about this. How does one build this subnational competitive environment, and what can the center do to ease the space for states to actually genuinely make themselves competitive for business?
Vini, are you there? I think there's slightly...
Yes, Yamini, thank you. You've asked a tough one, not surprised. I think what the government of India, at least in the last few years, seems to be doing is to make a competitive environment for the states to seek to become, if not number one in various things, at least not to be at the rock bottom. That seems to be very much what the NITI is pushing at. So there are all kinds of indices that have been built up. Some of them, frankly, not through. We had this terrible one on governance where stocks and flows were all mixed up and so on. But that's fine. I mean, those things will sort themselves out. So one thing is to bring in a competitive spirit. I think the thing that perhaps needs to be focused on a little more is sharing of best practice, because there are states that are doing well on certain parameters. There's a lot of forward movement in many aspects, and it really helps for this cross-learning to happen. However, much of the action, I believe, really is at the state level. So while, as I said, GOI can help by making life more competitive for the states and also improving collaboration, and I think both things should go together. It's not one or the other, but eventually it is up to the states to look at their own environment, to look at their own capacities and build on them. Yamini, you of all people know what, for example, we've been trying in Punjab. So recognizing that we need thought leadership going beyond the usual bureaucracy options. We have a state advisory council with some of the brightest brains that we could gather, including Yamini, your own. We also have a corresponding team of bright young kids, including those some who have graduated from LSC, Mukulika, working with us in the state at practically nominal remuneration, but working so hard. And I mean, these kids, they quickly took over the role of being our COVID frontline management. And I started collecting the data, doing analysis as a very professional daily report that they bring out that, I wake up to and I see this young kid has actually put it out sometimes at 2 a.m. and other times going up to 4 a.m. because they were just getting all the data in and analyzing and making those charts so that we can, as decision makers, see how is the case fertility rate moving, how is the positivity moving, and so on. And by the way, Punjab is one of the states that's really done well. Touch wood, fingers crossed. So far, so good. We are amongst the best in the country. So we did that. We brought in this whole tech team. So perhaps only state to have a chief technology officer supported by tech experts at market-driven prices, because there is a desperate need to do that. The Punjab Police has a pro bono chief technology officer and IIM grad. So what do you know? There is a lot of interest, I think, in giving back. There is opportunity, and we saw so much of that in COVID, for instance. I mean, my IIM Calcutta group, some people not in my batch, but they got together and said, can we help in any way? And yes, of course you can help. So they've done such awesome work in the IT space, helping us with our COVA app, vetting it for us, supporting in so many ways in the tech space, but there are so many other ways too. So I think every state needs to think through. There need to be some systemic changes also in how we hire, in what kind of incentives we're able to put in place. Those are more difficult conversations, but I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop here.
Mukulika, you're muted.
Sajid, did you want to say something briefly? Were you waiting to say? No, okay. Because I really need to wrap up. So I think I am going to wrap up by saying I will thank my panelists in a minute, but I think to the audience, I hope this very brief discussion, which has scratched the surface, but I think what our panelists have done very deftly is given us a sense of the complexity of the issues. So when people sitting abroad looking to invest in India, look at India, they see an opportunity, but they also see challenges. And I think we have now a much better sense of the depth of the challenges and what kind, the nature, the texture of those challenges. But also, I think just in the representation of thought leadership on this panel, from macroeconomists to academic researchers to civil servants. I think there is a huge amount of capacity in the country to meet these challenges. We are not short on that at all. But these dots need to be joined. And I think through discussions like this, through the State Capacity Initiative, we need to have more of these discussions, and this is an ongoing project. But as Vini just said, I think we are not short also of LSE producing fantastic students who go back with a great sense of commitment to India and the country. And there are a lot of people, young people, involved in this journey. So let's just hope that this we can actually take this somewhere positive in the future. Thank you all for listening.
Namaste, hello, and welcome to India Global Week 2020. Be the Revival, India and a Better Place in the World. That was a great session. A huge thanks to our moderator and expert panel. We're going to move on right to our next panel because I know we're running out of time here. We're running a little late, few minutes late. Stay tuned. We want to hear from you. Put your thoughts, your questions using hashtag Be the Revival on your, and hopefully we'll see it up here. I'm tracking it myself along with the other hosts, so be sure to post something up for us. With that being said, we're going to move on right to our next panel discussion. Stay tuned here at India Global Week. This is Priyanka Deo reporting from New Delhi.